Klaus Kinski was one of the greatest actors of the century, but also a monster and a great pestilence. I'm not saying that, Werner Herzog said it. And Herzog would know. He directed Kinski in 5 films, and their relationship was one of the strangest in cinema history. At times they seemed like creative soulmates, at other times they seemed like sworn enemies. As Herzog once put it, there was mutual respect, even as we both planned each other's murder. And of course, you could never mistake Klaus Kinski for anybody else. Those enormous, expressive eyes, those huge lips, that sharp, almost predatory face, he looked like a man who had wandered in from a fever dream. Kinski's career crossed genres, countries and languages. He appeared in spaghetti westerns, horror films, war films, dramas, thrillers, and a lot of German Edgar Wallace crime films. But today he's probably best remembered for the 5 films he made with Werner Herzog between 1972 and 1987. And yes, we will talk about those films, but we also have to talk about Herzog's documentary about him, My Best Fiend, because with Klaus Kinski, the man behind the actor is almost as wild as his wildest roles. Klaus Günther Karl Kinski was born in 1926 in Sopot in the free city of Danzig, today Sopot, Poland. When he was a child, his family moved to Berlin, and that is where Kinski spent most of his youth. In 1943, at the age of 17, he was conscripted into the Wehrmacht. According to most accounts, he saw little or no combat until the winter of 1944, when his unit was sent to the German-occupied Netherlands. On only his second day of combat, he was captured by the British Army. But with Kinski, even the basic facts are never completely simple. In his autobiography, he claimed that he had actually deserted from the army, was recaptured by the Germans, sentenced to death, escaped again, and was eventually found by a British unit while he was hiding in the woods. Werner Herzog, however, later said that Kinski fabricated large parts of his autobiography, including some of its most extreme claims. So, already at the very beginning of the story, we run into the problem that follows Kinski everywhere. There is the self-created myth, then there is the real man, and it's very hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. After his return to Germany, Kinski started out as an actor, first at a small touring company in Offenburg, where he first used the name Klaus Kinski. In 1946, he was hired by the renowned Schlosspark Theater in Berlin, but he was fired the following year due to his unpredictable behavior. He found work at other theater companies thereafter, but his emotional volatility regularly got him into trouble. Because of this, it was hard for him to find a stable contract. Even when plays with him were successful and the audience cheered, it was difficult for him to stay anywhere for long. In 1950, Kinski stayed in a psychiatric hospital in West Berlin for 3 days after stalking his theatrical sponsor and attempting to strangle her. Yeah, medical records from the period listed preliminary diagnosis of schizophrenia, but the doctor's ultimate conclusion was psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder. Kinski soon became unable to secure film roles, and in 1955 he attempted suicide twice. Around 1956, living jobless in Vienna, Kinski reinvented himself as a monologuist and spoken word artist, and that brought him the first wave of success.
Ich bin nicht euer Superstar!
After the wild stage monologues, Kinski's screen career kept moving in strange and fascinating directions. In 1970, he appeared in Count Dracula, directed by Jesus Franco, where he played Renfield opposite Christopher Lee, another legendary Dracula actor and one of cinema's great gothic icons. I just made a full video about him, by the way, link in the corner if you want to check it out. Around the same period, Kinski also became a familiar face in European genre films, especially spaghetti westerns. Already appeared in Sergio Leone's For a Few Dollars More in 1965 and in The Great Silence in 1968, where he played one of his coldest and most memorable villains. And it was these kind of roles that caught Werner Herzog's attention. From there, one of cinema's strangest, most intense and most turbulent creative partnerships was born. Before getting into the Herzog films, we have to mention My Best Fiend, the documentary Herzog made about his strange, explosive relationship with Klaus Kinski. It's not just a behind-the-scenes film, it feels almost like Herzog trying to understand what this partnership really was. Was it a friendship, a rivalry, obsession? Probably all of those things at once.
I had sent Kinski my screenplay, and 2 nights later at 3 a.m. I was awakened by the phone. At first I couldn't figure out what was going on. All I heard were inarticulate screams at the other end of the line.
Aguirre, The Wrath of God was the first of Kinski's 5 collaborations with Werner Herzog, and in many ways it set the tone for everything that came after it. Shot deep in the Peruvian rainforest, on real rivers and rough terrain, the production already had the feeling of an expedition slowly losing its mind. The cast and crew climbed through jungle, traveled on rafts built by local craftsmen, and even lost sets and rafts when a storm caused the river to flood. That humid, hot and wild environment was the perfect breeding ground for Kinski's madness, and they clashed with Herzog from the very beginning. Herzog wanted the character to be quietly dangerous, Kinski played it as a madman. So when you watch Aguirre drifting down the river, slowly becoming more delusional and more dangerous, it actually feels way too real, because it was. But in a strange way, their partnership survived this, and Kinski came back to play different characters in Herzog's films, and some of those roles were his most memorable ones. With Nosferatu the Vampyre, Herzog wasn't just remaking a horror classic, he was almost trying to reconnect German cinema with one of its great lost shadows. The original Nosferatu from 1922 was an unauthorized version of Dracula, which is why the name was changed, but by Herzog's version the novel was in the public domain already. And Kinski's version is fascinating because he isn't the elegant, seductive Dracula of the Hammer films or the otherworldly presence that Lugosi was. He is lonely, diseased, ancient and almost pathetic, but still very dangerous. It's one of his strangest performances. Somehow he makes the monster feel both terrifying and sad at the same time. Woyzeck is one of Kinski's most bare-bone Herzog performances. There is no big adventure here, no jungle, no vampire makeup, just a broken man being slowly trampled by poverty, jealousy, humiliation, and just the people around him.
Was soll ich machen?
Herzog shot it very quickly after Nosferatu, while Kinski was still physically and emotionally exhausted, and that matters, because you can feel it in the film. It was a great choice from him, capturing that moment and using Kinski's state to the advantage of the film. It's not a villain role exactly, but it's one of his darkest morally grey characters, because you can understand his suffering while also still seeing the horror of where it leads. If Aguirre, the Wrath of God, was the beginning of the Herzog-Kinski jungle legend, then Fitzcarraldo was where that legend became almost hard to believe. Once again, Herzog dragged a film crew deep into the South American jungle, but this time the central image of the story was also the central madness of the production. A huge steamship being physically hauled over a mountain, through the rainforest, without special effects. Everything around the film seemed cursed. There were accidents, illness, hostile conditions, and stories that almost sound too insane to be true, including crew members surviving a plane crash, and one local worker reportedly cutting off his foot with a chainsaw after being bitten by a venomous snake. And in the middle of all this was Klaus Kinski, playing a man possessed by an impossible dream, while apparently becoming almost impossible to work with himself. He screamed, raged, fought with Herzog, and helped turn the production into one of the most infamous filmmaking ordeals ever captured on screen. You can see the horror on the faces of the indigenous extras who worked on the production. They came from a very different culture, where problems and conflicts were handled in a very different way.
Towards the end of shooting, the Indians offered to kill Kinski for me. They said, "Shall we kill him for you?" And I said, "No, for God's sake, I still need him for shooting. Leave him to me, leave him to me."
So if you want to know more about this film's insane shoot and hear even more of Kinski's legendary raging, check out My Best Fiend. It's definitely worth seeking out. Cobra Verde was the fifth and final film Herzog made with Kinski, and by this point their partnership was basically burning itself to the ground. Kinski plays Francisco Manuel da Silva, a Brazilian bandit who becomes involved in the slave trade, so this is easily one of his ugliest and most morally rotten characters. The film was shot on location in Ghana, Brazil and Colombia, and the production seemed to have pushed the Herzog-Kinski relationship past the point of no return. Kinski was reportedly out of control during the shoot, and after this, Herzog never worked with him again. So Cobra Verde feels like a fitting end to their collaboration. It's a beautiful film, but with very disturbing undertones. After Herzog, Kinski still kept returning to dark and strange roles. In Crawlspace from 1986, he played Dr. Karl Günther, a disturbed landlord who spies on his tenants and turns the apartment building into his own private trap. Again, seems like the perfect role for this madman, and I'm not even sure how much acting was required here. Then came Vampire in Venice in 1988, also known as Nosferatu in Venice, where Kinski returned to the vampire myth one last time, this time opposite Christopher Plummer and Donald Pleasence. Even that production reportedly became chaotic, with Kinski's behavior on set causing serious problems. By this point, the line between Kinski the actor and Kinski the man had become almost impossible to separate. It often felt like if he was performing even when the cameras weren't rolling, or perhaps even worse, simply being himself when they were. He died only a few years later in 1991 from a sudden heart attack at his home in California. He was just 65 years old. Now, here on this channel, I often say that the actors who play villains are usually some of the most down-to-earth, friendly and generous people in the business. Unfortunately, that is not something we can really say about Klaus Kinski. Yes, he clearly had serious mental health issues, but there are also far too many dark stories connected to him to simply explain everything away with that. His daughters, Paula Kinski and actress Nastasia Kinski, were both afraid of him, and no child should ever be afraid of their parents. Paula wrote in her autobiography that he abused her from the age of 5. Nastasia described him as an unpredictable tyrant, and those are not small accusations. They cast a very long shadow over the man behind the performances. So where does that leave us? I think we can still recognize Klaus Kinski as an extraordinary actor. We can still talk about the intensity, the madness and the strange beauty he brought to the screen. But we also don't have to romanticize him. There is the artist and there is the damage he caused. And with Kinski, those two things are very hard to separate completely. He really was an amazing actor, but he was also a deeply damaged man who seemed to have damaged many people around him. And honestly, that is a very high price to pay for art. Now, of course, I couldn't mention all of his roles, so if you feel like I left out an important one, please drop it in the comments. If you like what you've seen, stick around. More character actor portraits and film essays are on the way. Thanks for watching.